Chapter 1. The Duel That Never Happened. It was a damp September morning when Holmes returned from a brisk walk through Regent's Park, a rolled-up newspaper under one arm, and the faint scent of pipe smoke clinging to his coat despite his time outdoors. He entered our Baker Street rooms without ceremony, nodded briefly to me as I lowered my paper, and proceeded directly to the mantelpiece, where he lit a match and held it to the end of a long, slender pipe. "I take it," I ventured, "that the morning air has yielded nothing more pressing than condensation and horse droppings." Holmes gave a soft grunt. "On the contrary, Watson, something of interest has emerged." He tossed the crumpled paper onto the table between us. "Page 3, lower column. The Society notices, as our lesser journalists like to call them." I unfolded the paper and read aloud. "It is with great relief that Society has learned of the cancellation of the duel scheduled between Sir Rowland Merton and Major Basil Travers, following what was described by both parties as a gentleman's misunderstanding. The dispute, which had caused much chatter among the clubs of Pall Mall and Piccadilly, was said to concern an insult at the Imperial Fencing Hall. Reconciliation was reportedly achieved at the offices of Merton's solicitor yesterday evening. I looked up. A near duel, averted by lawyers, no less. Hardly your usual matter." Holmes was already pacing the carpet. "Precisely why it interests me. Men of that temperament, honour-bound military men, no strangers to blood and pride, do not typically retreat into parlour discussions at the 11th hour, especially not when the affair had already made its rounds through half the drawing-rooms of Mayfair." He stopped short by the window. "No, something else intervened. The cancellation of a duel, Watson, is far more intriguing than the duel itself, for it suggests that someone, somewhere, did not want the truth to be revealed at dawn. Take it you have more than society gossip to go on?" Holmes tilted his head toward the small table by the front door. A card lay there, cream-coloured, embossed with a silver crest of a coiled serpent. I rose and picked it up. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I require your discretion and brilliance. A matter of urgency, of life, death, and honour. Sir Rowland Merton." The address was printed on the reverse. An elegant house in Belgravia. Sir Rowland himself? I asked, surprised. What could he possibly want now that the matter has been resolved? Holmes offered a tight smile. "Resolved? In name, perhaps. But mark my words, Watson. There is a lie hiding behind this reconciliation. A duel was planned, prepared for, and then vanished in the night like smoke from a chimney. I have seen many crimes covered by violence, but when men conspire to avoid violence, it suggests a cover-up of a different breed. Within the hour, we were rattling through the streets of London in a cab, the city a patchwork of coal smoke and greying light. Holmes was quiet, hands steepled beneath his chin, while I reviewed what little we knew of the parties involved. Sir Rowland Merton, Baronet, decorated in the Afghan campaign, member of the Imperial Fencing Hall. Major Basil Travers, a career soldier, recently returned from India, known for his quick temper and fondness for sharp steel. Both men, by all accounts, had reputations to protect. We arrived in Belgravia just past 10. The house was a red-bricked edifice with white pillars and an air of overcompensated grandeur. The butler who admitted us was unusually pale, his voice low and uncertain as he led us to the drawing-room. Sir Rowland stood by the fireplace, tall and lean, his moustache immaculately waxed, though there was something hollow behind the smoothness of his greeting. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am most grateful you came." Holmes inclined his head but did not sit. "You summoned me with a promise of urgency, yet the matter you are involved in appears, on the surface, to have been resolved." Sir Rowland's jaw tightened. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, nothing is resolved. The duel, yes, it was called off, but not by my hand nor by Travers. We were intercepted, persuaded, threatened. I leaned forward. Threatened? By whom? That I do not know. Only that I received a letter. No signature, no return. Inside, one sentence, written in red ink. Blood has already been spilt. Do not spill more." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And Travers?" he asked. "He received the same. We compared notes. I have the letter, if you'd care to see it." Holmes took it from him carefully. The handwriting was jagged, the ink dry but not smudged. A faint scent clung to the paper, something sharp, metallic. "There was more," Sir Rowland added. "My fencing valet, Jules, was found unconscious that same night, locked in the weapons room, nothing stolen. But someone had been inside." Holmes looked up sharply. "The same weapons room where your dueling sabres are kept?" "Yes." "Then someone wanted access, or to leave a message." Sholmes straightened. "Sir Rowland, you were not meant to fight a duel. You were meant to believe you were going to, until the precise moment when fear or confusion took root. Someone has orchestrated this affair for reasons yet unknown." "And what do you suggest I do now, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You do nothing. Continue as though nothing has happened. But tell no one we have spoken. The duel that never happened may yet uncover a crime that already has." Outside, the rain had begun to fall in earnest. Holmes turned his collar up as we stepped back into the street. "There is something rotten behind this, Watson," he said, "and it began not with swords, but with silence." I followed him through the mist, uncertain of where we were headed, but knowing full well that the game, though quiet for now, had already begun. Chapter 2. An invitation to shadows the following. Morning found Holmes unusually silent at breakfast. He had slept but little, his thoughts clearly fixed on Sir Rowland's peculiar tale. I, too, found myself unable to put the matter from my mind. There was something deeply unsettling in the notion of a duel, thwarted not by cowardice or second thoughts, but by a cryptic letter and a valet rendered unconscious. It smacked not of melodrama, but of orchestration, a careful hand behind the curtain, tugging on invisible threads. Holmes took no toast, only coffee, which he consumed while, seated cross-legged in the armchair by the window, his gaze distant as the faint light of morning filtered through the London fog. He had placed Sir Rowland's red-inked note on the mantelpiece, propped against a small Egyptian figurine, as though it were a relic of some forgotten rite. I finally broke the silence. "You believe someone was trying to prevent the duel, yet not out of goodwill?" Holmes did not look up. "Indeed, the wording of the message is everything. Blood has already been spilt. That is not a warning to prevent tragedy, Watson. It is a veiled assertion. Someone is suggesting that the Matter is already closed, but by whose hand? He rose suddenly, the energy returning to his limbs like a current snapping into a wire. I intend to find out. A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson appeared, her expression neutral but curious. A letter just arrived, Mr. Holmes. No name on the front, just, well, you'd better see it. He took it without comment. It was sealed with black wax, the impression bearing the crest of a bird's claw clutching a dagger. Holmes opened it swiftly. The paper was the same quality as that which had held the earlier warning, thin, expensive, and faintly perfumed. But the writing this time was different. If you wish to understand the truth of Sir Rowland Merton's survival, come to the Imperial Fencing Hall tonight at 10:30. Come alone. Burn this note. Holmes smiled faintly as he passed it to me. Now the spider invites the fly. But it's an obvious trap, I exclaimed. Surely you can't go alone? Trap or not, it is the only thread we have. Fencing Hall will be empty by that hour, and I know the place well enough to navigate its blind corners. You won't seriously? I never said I would go alone. That evening Holmes dressed in black from head to toe, an attire he reserved for outings of a clandestine nature. I, on the other hand, was tasked with playing the shadow. It was arranged that I would arrive separately and wait across the street, watching for anything out of the ordinary. The Imperial Fencing Hall was situated near Pall Mall, its exterior grand but not ostentatious, an old-world facade of grey stone and Corinthian columns. Holmes entered at precisely 10:30, melting into the darkness of the side entrance with the ease of a man returning to familiar ground. I remained outside, coat collar turned up, my watch ticking too slowly in the quiet. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The street remained empty. Just as the half-hour mark began to tick toward 3/4, a shadow detached itself from the alley opposite. A man, slight of build, wearing a dark overcoat and a hat pulled low over his brow, stepped briskly toward the entrance Holmes had used. He paused, looked left and right, and then slipped inside. I resisted the urge to follow immediately. Holmes had trained me well. Observe first, act later. A few minutes more, I told myself. Then a sound, a faint clang, metal on metal, from within the building. It was enough. I crossed the street and entered, revolver holstered beneath my coat, every sense alert. The interior was dark, save for the faint gleam of moonlight through high-set windows. I moved silently through the outer chamber and into the training hall itself, the scent of waxed wood and old sweat rising to meet me. "Holmes?" I whispered. No answer. Then a voice, low and clipped, from beyond the fencing gallery. "You shouldn't have come." I crept forward, peering around the edge of the partition. Holmes stood beneath one of the gas lamps, facing a man whose back was to me. The man held something in his hand, a small vial or bottle, its contents gleaming, faintly even in the dim light. "The message was yours," Holmes said calmly. The man nodded. "A warning, Mr. Holmes. You are not welcome here. Some matters, duels included, are best left forgotten." Holmes stepped forward, unfazed. "And what is it, precisely, that you wish to keep buried? Who died, sir, while Sir Rowland and Major Travers staged their dance?" The man moved, quick as a fencer's thrust. The vial shattered at Holmes's feet, releasing a puff of noxious smoke that stung the eyes and throat. By the time I rushed forward, pistol drawn, the figure had already vanished into the warren of passages behind the gallery. Holmes was coughing, but unharmed. He gestured towards the remnants of the vial. Chloroform, I believe. A theatrical gesture. Our mysterious messenger is growing nervous. I helped him upright. He could have attacked you. But he didn't. He sought only to disorient, to escape, which means, Watson, that we are closer than we thought. As we exited into the street once more, the night had grown colder. Holmes paused, gazing back at the fencing hall. "One man is already dead," he murmured. "He died before the duel was ever cancelled, and unless we uncover his name, another will surely follow." We walked home in silence, both of us aware that we had only begun to peel back the first layer of this twisted affair. Chapter 3. A Visitor from the Past. The following morning dawned bleak and overcast, a low mist hugging the rooftops of Baker Street and curling against the glass of our sitting-room windows. Holmes, having slept but little, was already at work when I descended for breakfast. The remnants of the shattered vial had been carefully transferred into a sealed jar on the mantel, and his chemistry set hissed faintly from the table, a whiff of iodine and ammonia heavy in the air. "You will note," Holmes said without preamble, that our mysterious guest was neither careless nor entirely anonymous. The composition of the smoke last night contained not only chloroform, but a trace of belladonna, enough to distort perception for a brief time, but not to incapacitate, a distraction, nothing more. "And the man himself?" I asked, seating myself across from him. Holmes tapped a gloved finger against the rim of his teacup. "Well spoken. Middle height, good posture, right-handed, a faint limp in the left foot, and a callus on the index finger of the right hand, likely from sabre grip rather than foil. A former soldier, or more likely, an instructor of some repute." "You deduced that in under 5 minutes." "In under 15 seconds, Watson. The rest merely confirmed what my senses told me." He offered a faint smile, but it was quickly interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared with her usual efficient grace, announcing a visitor. "A Colonel Edmund Ashe, sir. He insists it's of national importance. Rather worked up, if I may say." Holmes raised a brow and gestured for the Colonel to be shown in. The man who entered was tall and broad-shouldered, with an air of military discipline evident in every step. His moustache was as neat as his polished boots, and the tightly buttoned coat suggested a man unused to the relaxed pace of civilian life. His eyes were grey and sharp, though his expression betrayed more worry than command. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." He inclined his head curtly. "I apologize for the unannounced intrusion, but I fear time is no longer on our side." Holmes offered him a seat with emotion. "Colonel Ashe, if I am not mistaken, you commanded the 5th Regiment during the Maratha campaign?" "I did," Ashe said, visibly surprised. "You've heard of me?" "Only through footnotes in a well-worn dispatch from the Punjab frontier. Your name appeared alongside Sir Rowland Merton's more than once." The Colonel's mouth tightened. "Then you may understand the seriousness of what I'm about to say. Sir Rowland and I were once closer than brothers. We served together, bled together. But something dark, followed us home from India. Holmes said nothing, but his gaze had sharpened. "I came to you," Ash continued, "because Sir Rowland sent me a note 3 days ago. It was brief, disjointed, and unlike him. He spoke of being haunted by the past, of an unseen adversary who knew what we had buried, and he mentioned the name Navjeet." That name appeared to stir Holmes. He stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Navjeet," Holmes repeated. "The interpreter who vanished near Simla." Ash nodded. "Yes, at the time we thought he had fled, possibly with secrets. But now I wonder if we were wrong. You and Sir Rowland knew the truth of his disappearance. I don't say that lightly," Ash said. "There were misunderstandings. The man had knowledge of certain financial matters, government transfers, missing payrolls, and he threatened to expose some discrepancies. We thought we had contained the matter. But now," Holmes turned, his eyes bright, "now someone has returned, using Navjeet's name like a blade held to Sir Rowland's throat. I believe Sir Rowland feared for his life, Mr. Holmes, and not from Travers." At this, Watson leaned forward. "Do you suspect the duel itself was a cover?" "Perhaps. It would be a perfect distraction. Honour demands privacy. The field was arranged, but if someone intended to silence Rowland permanently, they could have done so without witnesses. Blame it on pride and pistols." Holmes lifted the letter Ash had brought, scanning it with practised speed. This was written by a desperate man. "He asked me to meet him last night," Ash said, voice thickening. "But he never arrived. Now I learn you were attacked at the fencing hall by someone quite skilled at keeping their face in shadow," Holmes said. "They used theatre, but not murder. Not yet." Ash stood. "I will not let Rowland fall into danger alone. If there's anything—" "There is," Holmes interrupted. "You must speak to no one about this, not even those closest to you. The fewer who know the deeper truth, the better." "And what will you do?" "I intend to pay a visit to the one person who knows the rhythm of duels and the scent of blood on gloves." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, I believe it is time we spoke to Major Travers." The name fell with weight between us. The man whose pistol had been aimed at Sir Rowland's heart, whose temper had ignited this strange chain of events, and yet whose motives remained oddly veiled. As Colonel Ash departed, Holmes retrieved a Veikshi slim notebook from the desk drawer. He flipped through the pages, revealing sketches of sword hilts, diagrams of duel etiquette, and copied excerpts of fencing manuals. "Tell me, Watson," he said thoughtfully, "what sort of man arranges a duel only to be upstaged by a letter that insists the matter has already been resolved?" I considered this, unsure. Holmes smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Either a man who regrets, or a man who knows more than he claims. And I intend to find out which. The case, which had begun as an oddity, now breathed like something alive. A beast curled beneath the surface, stirring in shadow, and as we prepared to leave for the Major's address in Kensington, I knew that Holmes had begun to see its true shape. Chapter 4. The Man with the Scar on His Wrist. The address Colonel Ash had provided for Major Alaric Travers brought us to an unassuming red-brick townhouse on a quiet street in Kensington. A half-polished plaque beside the door read Travers & Co., Military Outfitters, though it bore no signs of recent commerce. The windows were clean, but the drapes drawn, and a curious sense of desertion clung to the property. Holmes rapped twice, sharply. After a moment, the door creaked open to reveal a man of compact build, his dark eyes hooded and his moustache clipped to martial perfection. Though his hair was greying at the temples, his posture was that of a soldier still on parade. His right hand, however, was gloved, even indoors, even now. "Major Travers?" Holmes inquired. "I am he," the man replied, his voice low and wary. "I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. John Watson. We come in regard to Sir Rowland Merton." At the mention of the name, Travers' jaw tightened. He stepped aside wordlessly and gestured us into a narrow hallway. The scent of pipe smoke and saddle oil lingered faintly. Everything was in order, yet the air felt curiously brittle. He led us into a sitting room, sparsely furnished. A sabre hung above the hearth, and on the mantel stood a single photograph. Sir Rowland and Travers younger, side by side in uniform, smiling in the blaze of what appeared to be some far-off tropical sun. Holmes took a seat by the fire, but did not warm his hands. "You were to duel Sir Rowland yesterday morning," he said. Travers did not blink, and I did. Watson leaned forward. "You fired?" We paced, we turned. I fired high. Rowland chose not to fire at all. Holmes regarded him with curiosity. A curious resolution. Travers's eyes narrowed. The matter was settled. Holmes tilted his head. "Settled by your pistol missing, or his failing to fire?" A pause. Then, with deliberate slowness, Travers removed his glove. Across the wrist of his right hand was a narrow, pale scar, not fresh, but not long-healed either. Watson, ever the physician, recognized it at once. "That's a dueling scar," he said quietly, "but not from yesterday. No," Travers admitted, "from the night before." He rose, turned his back to us, and walked to the window. The silence stretched. "We met privately," Travers said finally, still facing away. "In the old style. No seconds. Just the two of us, at Sir Rowland's insistence. He said it was the only way to prevent scandal. His family couldn't endure another." Holmes frowned. "Another?" Travers turned. "His brother. Suicide years ago. Left a note, a mess, a name Sir Rowland never spoke aloud again. He's carried it ever since." "And what prompted your quarrel with him?" Holmes asked. Travers hesitated, then spoke through clenched teeth. "He accused me of betrayal. Claimed I had reawakened something he had buried, something from India. But I swear to you, Holmes, I had no such intention. Our falling out was over a woman, or so I thought." Watson exchanged a glance with Holmes. "Do go on," Holmes said. Travers returned to his chair, his voice quieter now. "Her name was Viola Quenby, a governess, recently arrived from Suffolk. She had a mind of her own, and a habit of walking alone in Hyde Park, much to the displeasure of Rowland's circle. He was infatuated, but something about her unsettled him. Said she asked questions no governess would know to ask. "Did you know her well?" Holmes asked. Travers stared into the fire. "Well enough to be accused of trying to steal her affections. But I suspect now that Rowland thought she was something else entirely." "A spy?" Watson ventured. Travers shook his head. "No, a ghost. The words hung in the air. She asked him about a man named Navjit, said she had reason to believe he'd been betrayed by his employers, that he was never paid for what he knew. Holmes stood suddenly and paced. Sir Rowland faced a phantom from his past, and the woman conjuring it disappeared. Travers looked up sharply. "You know!" "She came to see me," Holmes said, "but she did not return. I believe she is now missing, or worse." Travers turned the glove in his hands, expression hardening. "I feared as much. She was being followed. Once she confided that she had intercepted a telegram not meant for her. Something about Ashbury Crossing, and a date, the 18th of March. Holmes stopped. "That's tomorrow." Watson frowned. "Do you think it's a rendezvous? Or a reckoning?" Holmes muttered. "Tell me, Major, why didn't you inform Scotland Yard?" Travers laughed bitterly. "You think they'd listen to a duelist, a disgraced officer, accused of slander and shadows? No, I buried it." Holmes nodded, as though confirming a theory. Men who bury secrets are often forced to dig them up with trembling hands. He turned to the fireplace, staring at the sabre above the mantel. "Watson," he said without looking back, "we must speak with Sir Rowland, urgently, before the 18th dawns." Travers stood, uncertain. "What will you do?" "Attend to a whisper that refuses to die," Holmes replied, "and find the view a woman who asked the wrong question of the wrong man." Outside the wind had picked up. The grey skies above Kensington began to darken with more than just weather. Chapter 5. A Telegram from Ashbury Crossing. The following morning found us once again at Baker Street. The fire lit against a chill that had crept in with the rain. Holmes stood by the window, his silhouette tall and still against the grey morning light. I had learned not to disturb him in these moods, but the silence had drawn on long enough to test even my patience. He spoke at last without turning. "Ashbury Crossing lies 32 miles west of London, a defunct railway post since the branch line was decommissioned, a station, a keeper's cottage, and nothing more." "You mean to go?" I asked, setting aside the morning paper, which featured only the vaguest reference to Sir Rowland's condition. "Disturbance of mind," it read euphemistically. "We are already going," he said simply. "Pack lightly, Watson." As I rose to prepare, he added, "Send a wire to Inspector Lestrade. Ask if any unclaimed bodies matching Miss Quenby's description have turned up along the Thames or its tributaries." I paused. "You think she's been killed, I think," Holmes said with narrowed eyes, "that someone very much wanted her silenced." We arrived at Ashbury Crossing by mid-afternoon, the last portion of the journey made by hired trap from the nearest town. The countryside here was bleak. Wet hedgerows, broken fences, and a landscape heavy with memory. The disused station emerged, from the mist like the husk of a ghost. 2 crumbling platforms flanked by a dilapidated shelter and a half-rotted signal box. A man in a weather-stained greatcoat was waiting for us. "Mr. Holmes?" he called, approaching with a limping gait. "You wired ahead. I'm Barker, keeper of the grounds." "Much obliged," Holmes replied. "Is there anywhere we might speak in private?" Barker nodded toward the old signal house. Still dry in there. The interior was close and smelled of rust and old grease, but it afforded shelter. Holmes wasted no time. We believe this station was the site of a secret meeting 2 days past. Did you see anyone?" Barker scratched his jaw. "Saw a woman, tall, dark coat, came just before sunset on the 18th, stood on the westbound platform for near an hour. Nervous, kept looking up the track. Did anyone else arrive? Later, yes, a man, clean cut, heavy overcoat. Walked up from the road, not from the tracks. They didn't talk long, 10 minutes maybe. Then he gave her something. She shook her head. He stepped toward her, and I saw her flinch. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Did you intervene? I started across, but he turned and left, quick too. She remained a while, then walked into the woods. Didn't see her again." "What direction did she go?" Holmes asked. Barker pointed. "Toward the Ashwick copse. Nothing out there, but brambles and rabbit dens." Holmes nodded. "We'll need to search the woods." Barker's brow creased. "She didn't seem lost, Mr. Holmes. She seemed resolved." We entered the copse under a ceiling of wind-tossed branches. The path narrowed to barely a trail, and the only sounds were the cawing of distant crows and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. Holmes moved like a man navigating a chessboard, his eyes flicking left and right, his attention grasping at fragments invisible to me. Then he stopped. "There," he said quietly, pointing to a patch of undergrowth where something pale fluttered like a trapped bird's wing. It was a torn handkerchief, monogrammed VQ Recent. Holmes murmured. "And look, Watson, just beside it. Half buried beneath damp leaves was a scrap of yellow paper, the ink slightly smudged but still legible. A telegram slip. To V. Quemby, 14 Russell Square, London Meet at Crossing. Tasse A2. March, 6:45 p.m. Come alone, matter of truth." Watson exhaled. So it was no coincidence. She was lured here. Holmes pocketed the telegram with the utmost care. "Indeed. And now we must ask, who sent it, and what truth did she seek?" He paused again. "Watson, footprints, leading away." I knelt beside him. A faint trail of boot marks led deeper into the copse. They were spaced far apart, someone running. We followed the tracks for several minutes until they vanished near a gnarled tree at the edge of a ravine. Something in the earth there had been disturbed, scraped or dug, and recently. Holmes knelt and cleared the soil away with his gloved hands. Beneath the loose top layer was a depression in the earth and a glint of metal. He drew out a locket, mud-streaked but still intact. "Viola Quenby's," Holmes said softly. "The one Travers claimed she always wore." He turned it over, revealing a tiny etched phrase in Latin. "Fiat lux, let there be light." Watson took a sharp breath. "So, what became of her?" Holmes stood, his face grim. "She left her token. Behind," he said, "either as a message or as a marker." We said little else as we made our way back toward the old station, the shadows growing long around us. The mystery had deepened. Viola Quenby had uncovered something old, something buried, and now she was gone. And yet I saw in Holmes's eyes a new certainty beginning to form. "Watson," he said at last, "I believe it is time we paid a second visit to Sir Rowland Merton. The duel had not ended with silence after all." Chapter 6. A conversation with a ghost back in London. A rain-slick fog lay heavy over Baker Street. obscuring the gas lamps and shrouding the city in a kind of muffled gloom. Holmes had said little. During the return journey from Ashbury Crossing, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes distant. But I knew that this apparent detachment belied the furious cogitation beneath. Viola Quenby was not simply missing. She had been drawn out deliberately, and now she had vanished, leaving behind a monogrammed handkerchief, a telegram, and a locket inscribed with Fiat Lux. It was nearly dusk when Holmes rose from his armchair, with sudden purpose. "Watson," he said, "fetch your coat. We are going to Belgrave Square. To see Sir Rowland again. To see what remains of him." The butler who received us at the Merton residence was a different man than before. Tall, angular, with a mournful expression, and no sign of the stiff formality we'd previously encountered. Holmes introduced us with his usual brevity. The man hesitated. "I believe Sir Rowland is under sedation again, sirs. Miss Adele has not permitted visitors." Holmes's gaze hardened. "Tell her Mr. Sherlock Holmes requires 10 minutes of her time. That is all." The butler returned some minutes later with a slight nod. "This way, if you please." We were shown not to the parlour, but to a small library tucked at the back of the house. Adele Merton stood there, dressed not in mourning, but in dark navy, her expression weary, yet composed. "You came," she said without surprise. "I thought you might." Holmes inclined his head. "Miss Merton, I regret that our visit must trouble you, but your brother's welfare, and possibly more, depends on clarity." Her arms folded tightly across her chest. "I don't believe he can give you that." "Nevertheless," Holmes said softly, "I must try." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "He's in the east drawing-room. He has good hours and bad. Just be kind." The drawing-room was warm but dim. Heavy curtains muffled what light the overcast evening might have offered, and the fireplace glowed faintly in the grate. Sir Rowland Merton sat by the hearth in a high-backed chair, wrapped in a dressing-robe. His face was drawn, his eyes fixed on the fire. "He did not acknowledge us at first, Sir Rowland," Holmes said gently, taking the seat opposite him. "It is I, Sherlock Holmes. We met 3 nights ago." "I remember," Merton murmured, voice brittle and cracking. "You examined my hands." Holmes gave the faintest smile. "Indeed, and I must trouble you with 1 or 2 more questions." Merton's gaze shifted slowly toward us. "She's dead, isn't she? That's what you've come to say." "We do not know that," I said, but the denial felt hollow. "She went there, for me," Merton whispered. "I told her too much." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Then perhaps you can help me understand what she went looking for, what danger she walked into." Merton closed his eyes. "It started with a letter, months ago, from someone I hadn't heard from in years. A man I once knew. He had something, proof, he said, of what happened at Eastbourne during the war, the friendly fire incident." Holmes nodded almost imperceptibly. "The one that was hushed up?" Merton's mouth twitched. "Not hushed, buried deep, and I helped them do it." He paused, staring into the flames. "But Viola, she wouldn't let it go. She said I needed to come clean before it destroyed me. She said she would find the man and bring me peace." Holmes's tone was careful. And she arranged to meet him at Ashbury Crossing? Merton's eyes glistened. I never told her to, but she found the name, the one I'd hidden. His voice dropped. Patterson, Lieutenant Geoffrey Patterson. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. That name, Holmes murmured. I have seen it before. I drew in a breath. The soldier who disappeared in 1902, presumed drowned. He didn't drown, Merton whispered. He vanished. After what? Happened in France. He wanted silence, or vengeance. I don't know which. And you believe he's alive? Holmes asked quietly. I did, until the telegram came. Holmes leaned forward. You mean the one that summoned Viola to Ashbury? Merton nodded. It was unsigned, but I know that phrasing. I know his words. Matter of truth. It was his phrase, always. Holmes rose slowly. Thank you, Sir Rowland. That will be enough for now. Merton's voice halted us at the door. If she's dead, then I am too. Holmes did not answer, but in his eyes I saw the first real shape of his deduction begin to form, one that extended beyond Sir Rowland's guilt, or even Viola's disappearance. Back in the hall, Adele waited silently. Holmes turned to her. Have you ever heard the name Geoffrey Patterson? She blinked once. Patterson? No. But Rowland mentioned Eastbourne once, years ago. He said it was where everything ended. Holmes studied her a moment longer, then inclined his head. I suspect it's also where we must begin. As we stepped back into the rain-slicked night, I asked, Do you think Patterson's truly alive? Holmes didn't answer directly. There are ghosts, Watson, he said, who carry no chains, but only because they've not yet been seen in daylight. Chapter 7. The Return to Eastbourne. The following morning dawned damp and grey, with a kind of persistent drizzle that settled into every collar and cuff. I found Holmes already up and attired, studying a small collection of military dispatches and personnel records spread across the breakfast table at Baker Street. He barely looked up as I entered. You were correct, Watson, he murmured. Geoffrey Patterson did serve in France with Merton's unit, but he did not die at sea, as the official report suggests. I took the chair opposite, lifting a buttered toast absently. Then where has he been all these years? Holmes's eyes gleamed. That is precisely what I intend to discover. Are we to leave for Eastbourne? Immediately. Pack lightly. I've already telegraphed Inspector Winterton of the Eastbourne Constabulary. He has agreed to grant us access to what remains of the Patterson file. Within the hour, we were aboard the 9:15 train from Victoria, the countryside sliding past in drizzly blur. Holmes was unusually silent for much of the journey, tapping his fingers restlessly against the armrest, his eyes closed in thought. When at last he spoke, it was with a crispness that told me he had drawn a thread from the tangled skein. There is something unnatural, Watson, in how many individuals tied to this case have become dislodged from official record. Viola Quenby's disappearance, Geoffrey Patterson's false death, and now the silence surrounding Eastbourne. You suspect a wider design. I suspect, Holmes said grimly, that we are dealing not with a crime of passion, but one born of systematic concealment, one thread in a greater tapestry. We arrived in Eastbourne shortly before noon. The seaside town had a faded charm, the kind one associated with stiff collars, wicker prams, and a quiet undercurrent of melancholy. Inspector Winterton met us at the station, a stout man with bristled whiskers and a wary regard for Holmes. "You won't find much," he said as he led us to the local station house. "The Patterson matter was officially closed nearly 20 years ago. Family vanished, house sold. No one made much noise about it then. Most assumed he'd gone mad and drowned himself. Were there any signs to support that assumption?" Holmes asked mildly. Winterton grunted. "A uniform folded on the rocks, a half-written letter in the house, some blood on a cracked window pane, but nothing decisive. Back then, we had fewer means and fewer questions." Holmes said nothing, but his eyes sharpened. Inside the constabulary's archive room, a cramped, dust-scented chamber with overburdened shelves, Holmes spent the better part of an hour poring through brittle pages and faded ink. I helped where I could, sifting through military rosters, weather reports, and local incident logs. At last, Holmes drew out a small folded telegram, its paper yellowed with age. "Here," he murmured, "was sent from Ashbury Crossing Station 2 days before Patterson's supposed death." I leaned in. "Private train car secured, Thursday, 9:15. Bring case, no names." Curious indeed. Holmes tapped the date with his finger. That was not the day he died, but the day he disappeared. Winterton peered over Holmes's shoulder. "Private train car? Who'd have the money for that?" "Someone desperate," Holmes replied, "or someone silencing desperation." From the constabulary, we made our way to the former Patterson home, now a boarding house operated by a Mrs. Lechmere, a prim woman with an iron bun and eyes that missed nothing. "Oh, yes," she said when Holmes inquired about the property's history. "Lieutenant Patterson lived here with his sister and a maid. Never saw much of him, reclusive type, the war having shaken him. Then one morning the whole household vanished. Rumours of debts or foreign travels, but the town soon stopped wondering." "Did anyone ever inquire since?" I asked. "Only a young woman some weeks ago," Mrs. Lechmere replied, knitting her brows. "Dark-haired, with a northern accent, asked about the cellar." Holmes turned sharply. "The cellar?" Mrs. Lechmere nodded. "Wanted to know if the original one was still accessible. Said she was researching old town layouts. I told her it had been bricked up after the war, never used since." Holmes asked, "Did she leave a name?" "She said Miss Vera Quentin." Holmes turned to me with a look of grim satisfaction. "Viola Quenby," he said, "using an alias. That afternoon we descended into the old Patterson cellar. The brickwork Mrs. Lechmere had spoken of remained intact at first glance, but Holmes found a section where the mortar had been disturbed. With Winterton's help, we removed the bricks one by one. Behind them, we found a narrow corridor, musty, damp, and long forgotten. It extended some 20 feet and terminated in what appeared to be a small storage chamber. There, by the beam of Holmes's lantern, we saw what had been hidden for decades. A rusted trunk, military in style, chained shut. And beside it, dust-covered, footprints, one set entering, none exiting. Holmes knelt beside the trunk and examined the lock. "It was opened recently," he said. "The dust has been brushed aside." I felt a chill. "Then she was here." Holmes nodded. "The question is, did she leave?" He stood brushing off his hands. "We are closer now, Watson. closer than we have ever been. This cellar holds the shadow of Patterson's secret, and perhaps Viola Quenby's last steps. Outside, the drizzle had grown into a full rain, falling with relentless persistence. But Holmes stood motionless beneath it, staring back at the house. "Tomorrow," he said, "we return to London. The truth waits behind the next veil." Chapter 8. A Case Reopened. It was late afternoon when we arrived back in London. This year, rain clinging to the city like an unwelcome fog. Holmes, cloaked in his Inverness, made no comment during the cab ride from Victoria Station to Baker Street, but I could sense his mind turning with furious intensity. His fingers tapped in complex rhythm upon the inside of the carriage, occasionally pausing mid-beat, as if an idea hovered just out of reach. Inside our lodgings, Mrs. Hudson had already stoked a fire in the hearth, the warmth filling the sitting room in welcome contrast to the weather. Holmes went immediately to his files, opening a drawer labelled Patterson. Eastbourne Inquiry. 1898. Dust rose as he flipped through the yellowed papers, his face tightening with each document. "There is a piece missing, Watson," he muttered. "We have footprints without a return path, a military trunk recently disturbed, and a young woman chasing a ghost." I sat beside the fire, rubbing warmth into my fingers. "You believe Viola Quenby is searching for Geoffrey Patterson?" "No," Holmes replied sharply. "She's searching for what Geoffrey Patterson knew." He selected a folded newspaper from the folder and handed it to me. The Eastbourne Gazette, 24th October, 1898. Note the headline. I read aloud, "Local officer declared dead in tragic cliffside fall." A rather brief report followed, describing Patterson's mysterious disappearance and the discovery of his uniform near the sea, with no body recovered. "Not much for a man of his supposed importance," I observed. "Precisely," said Holmes. "Geoffrey Patterson had no family to mourn him, no funeral, no formal military honours. His death was not investigated with the vigour afforded even to lesser men. Because someone wanted it forgotten? Or buried?" Holmes said, standing abruptly. "And someone else, Miss Quenby, has now disturbed the soil." He crossed to the fireplace and stood gazing into the flames. "It is time to speak with Miss Quenby directly. No more aliases, no more trailing footsteps. We must flush her out." "And how do you propose to do that?" Holmes turned to me with a glint of mischief. "By offering her what she desires most, access." The next morning I found myself seated across from a rather bewildered man named Henry Quenby, father of our elusive Miss Viola Quenby, and proprietor of a modest publishing house near Bloomsbury. Holmes had arranged the meeting by sending a note, posing as a literary agent interested in Miss Quenby's journalistic pieces. It was a ruse I wasn't entirely comfortable with, but Holmes insisted it was the only way. "Viola is driven," Mr. Quenby said cautiously. "Very bright, too bright, perhaps. She inherited her mother's stubborn streak, though she hides it behind civility. What's this really about, gentlemen?" Holmes didn't blink. "Your daughter has taken a great interest in a man named Geoffrey Patterson. We believe she recently visited Eastbourne under an assumed name." Mr. Quenby stiffened, then glanced about nervously. "Is she in trouble?" "Not with the law," Holmes said evenly, "but potentially with someone dangerous. We believe her investigation has touched upon something long concealed, something that others would prefer remain so. At last, Mr. Dargu Quenby sighed. She's obsessed with her uncle, my wife's brother. He died when Viola was just a child, but recently she found old letters. One, in particular, mentioned the duel that never happened. Since then, she's been convinced there was a cover-up. I couldn't dissuade her. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Do you still have that letter? Mr. Quenby nodded and retrieved a small envelope from his briefcase. Holmes examined it carefully before reading aloud. I cannot abide by silence any longer. The truth will out, if not by my hand, then by another's. I fear what might follow, but I will not be a party to deception. I await your reply. G.P. No address, Holmes murmured, but dated the 18th of October, 1898, 6 days before Patterson's supposed death, and written in a hand far too steady for a man ready to fling himself from a cliff. Mr. Quenby looked genuinely troubled. What should I do? Tell her to meet me, Holmes replied, alone, at the British Museum reading room, tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I'll know if anyone else is shadowing her. It was precisely 10 when Holmes and I entered the reading room. He chose a seat near the rear alcove beneath a window streaked with condensation. Viola Quenby entered 3 minutes later, wearing a sensible coat and a look of tightly guarded suspicion. She held a leather satchel and scanned the room carefully before making her way to Holmes. You sent my father into a panic, she said, lowering her voice as she sat. He thinks you're Scotland Yard. Holmes gave her a half-smile. They could never have pieced together what you have. She blinked. You know, I know you have been to Eastbourne. I know you found the cellar beneath the old Patterson house. And I know that what you seek is not a ghost, but a scandal. Stared at him, then slowly opened her satchel. Inside was a bundle of photographs, each carefully labelled. She slid one across the table, an image of the bricked wall, post-removal, revealing the old corridor we had found. I returned the next day, she said. There was something else in the trunk, beneath the false bottom. A diary. Fragments, really. Holmes's expression didn't change, but I sensed his excitement. He wrote of a pact, she continued, an agreement between him and another officer. One had been compromised, blackmailed. The other offered to help by faking a duel to explain a disappearance. Holmes nodded slowly, and someone ensured the disappearance became permanent. Viola's face tightened. There was a name mentioned in the diary, Merton. That's what led me to Lord Merton's recent death. I believe he's the one Patterson was protecting. Then perhaps, Miss Quenby, Holmes said softly, you and I have come to the same conclusion. She sat back in her chair, eyes locked with his. You believe Patterson is still alive? Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he tapped a single finger on the table. I believe someone wanted the world to think he was dead, but if that deception is to be exposed, we must find the man who never died. The three of us sat in silence, the murmur of the reading room around us like the hush before a storm. Chapter 9. A Voice from the Past. Holmes had always insisted that the surest way to discover the truth was to stir the waters and see what surfaces. Over the next 48 hours, stir them he did. with characteristic elegance and precision. He sent 3 telegrams under assumed names, arranged a visit to a private London club under false credentials, and requested records from the War Office under the pretext of a parliamentary inquiry. At least 2 of these acts skirted the boundary of legality, and all of them baffled me. But I knew better than to ask when Holmes was in such a mood. His focus was singular, his manner clipped, and his violin untouched. Something very real was taking shape behind his narrowed eyes. You recall the inscription in Patterson's journal? He asked me late that evening, once the fire had burnt low and the street lamps flickered yellow through the misted panes. About a pact and a man named Merton? Indeed, and yet I suspect Merton was never meant to be the recipient of Patterson's final letter. He retrieved the letter Miss Quenby had provided, dated mere days before Patterson's supposed death, and laid it flat beside an envelope recently delivered by courier. The handwriting on both was the same. "This," said Holmes, tapping the newer envelope, "was sent by a solicitor named Rivington in Kensington. Enclosed was a draft of an old deed, listing a cottage in Kent. Transferred in 1899 to a man named Jonathan Green. A name, I believe, was never used again." I frowned. "And you believe Green is—" "Patterson, of course. Or rather, the man who was once Geoffrey Patterson. Watson, we are looking for a man who ceased to exist by all official accounts nearly a decade ago. But if he has lived under a new name, in a secluded property no one connects to the military, we may yet find him. But what of Miss Quenby? She must not know, not yet." Holmes's tone was gentle but firm. "She is courageous but not cautious, and I fear the truth may yet be guarded by dangerous hands. We arrived in Kent by rail, then hired a trap to take us to the village of Lower Eastham, a scatter of stone cottages nestled in a wind-swept hollow that smelled of seaweed and damp hay. The lane Holmes directed the driver toward was narrow and overgrown, nearly forgotten by the world. The cottage stood beyond a crooked gate, cloaked in ivy and surrounded by bare trees. It was not abandoned, but nor was it inviting. A single window showed light behind a heavy curtain. As Holmes knocked, I noticed the faint glint of wire behind. The garden hedge. An early security measure? Or paranoia? The door opened with painful slowness. The man who stood before us was gaunt, but not feeble. His face was lined, and the hollows beneath his cheekbones spoke of long illness or perpetual vigilance. His eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp for a recluse. "I have been expecting you," he said. Holmes bowed his head slightly. "Then you know who I am." "I know of you. That will do." He led us into a sitting-room that smelled of pipe, tobacco and old books. Nothing in the furnishings suggested recent visitors. There were no photographs, no ornaments, only shelves, papers, and one large map, with pins inserted along the southern coast. "I will not give you my name," the man said, "but I suspect you have guessed it. Geoffrey Patterson." "Well," said quietly. The man neither confirmed nor denied it. Instead, he turned to Holmes. "Why have you come?" Holmes seated himself without invitation. "To ask a single question. Who died in your place?" A flicker of emotion passed over the man's face. Grief, perhaps, or shame. "A man who had nothing left," he replied. "A deserter. He begged me for mercy, and I gave him purpose." He wore my coat, carried my papers. I gave him a hero's death. He gave me a ghost's freedom. And Merton? Holmes asked. He knew. He arranged the disappearance. In return, I took the truth to my grave, or tried to. I leaned forward. Then why are you here? Why now? The man gave a dry, mirthless chuckle. Because Miss Quenby found the truth buried in my letters. And because Merton is dead, I saw it in the papers. With him gone, I am no longer bound. Bound to what? I asked. To silence, he replied, his eyes flickering to the hearth. To the shame of a scandal that would have ended lives and reputations. Then help us understand, said Holmes, his voice soft but commanding, because someone else is watching Miss Quenby now, someone who may not want the past disturbed. The deuced man considered this for a long moment. There were 3 of us, he said, Merton, myself, and Colonel Thomas Avery. Avery had secrets, compromising ones. Merton tried to protect him, but I refused. I threatened to go public. Merton feared what would happen, so he and Avery devised the duel as a story to cover my disappearance. But Avery panicked. He wanted me truly dead. That's when the switch was made. Holmes nodded slowly. And now Avery is a respected figure. Retired, perhaps, but still influential. A scandal would destroy his legacy. Which is why he will not hesitate to act again, the man said grimly. Tell Miss Quenby to stop. Tell her nothing more, or she may be the next to vanish. We left the cottage in silence, the wind pulling at our coats as the sun began to fall. Holmes was unusually quiet during the journey back, until at last he spoke. There's one thread left, Watson, one move left for the opponent. If they make it, I will have them. If not, he didn't finish the thought, but I could feel the chill in my spine that told me the endgame had begun. Chapter 10. The Missing Piece. Our return to Baker Street was met with rain, curtains of cold mist clinging to the windows, and a damp heaviness settling over the city. Holmes, still drenched from our dash to the hansom, peeled off his coat with absent-minded precision and dropped into his armchair. The fire crackled with reluctant warmth. He said not a word until Mrs. Hudson brought in tea, and then quietly vanished, leaving the scent of oversteeped Darjeeling in her wake. He sipped once, then set the cup down untouched. There is one thing, Watson, he said at last, that has troubled me from the start. A ghost, if you will, a whisper of contradiction. From Patterson? I asked. Holmes shook his head. From Miss Quenby. I blinked in surprise. You don't suspect her of any wrongdoing? Not in the ordinary sense, he replied, but she knows more than she believes. And one cannot know what one cannot see unless they have been shown it, either consciously or otherwise. The detail that troubles me is her recollection of the journal pages, specifically the missing ones. She said they were torn out, I recalled, left as if someone had taken just those entries and nothing else. Exactly. Holmes stood, hands clasped behind his back as he paced. But Watson, if Patterson, let us call him Patterson, though he may as well be Green, had gone to such lengths to disappear, would he have been so careless? To leave behind not only a letter to a woman, but also a journal that chronicled events tied to a deadly cover-up, I considered. It's possible he meant for her to find them. Precisely. Which means Miss Quenby was not just a loose thread. She was intended to target the whole tapestry. There was a knock at the door. I rose to answer, but Holmes was already there, flinging it open with theatrical swiftness. Standing on the threshold, dripping with rain and looking thoroughly miserable, was Inspector Lestrade. "Holmes," he said, brushing water from his hat, "I think we've a body." Holmes turned without a word, gesturing for him to follow. "Come in, Lestrade. You're just in time for a revelation." Lestrade looked between us with suspicion, but obeyed, lowering himself into the chair opposite the hearth. "Where?" Holmes asked. "Wapping Dock. Empty warehouse. Man found shot. Close range. We found a military ID on him. Colonel Thomas Avery." At that, Holmes's eyes narrowed. "No sign of struggle." "None. Shot clean through the heart. Gun beside him. No witnesses." "Suicide," Lestrade shrugged. "Appears so, but I know better than to label anything too quickly when you're on a case." Holmes stepped away from the fire, his voice lower now. "Watson and I visited a man yesterday, an alleged deserter who faked his own death with Merton's help. Avery had motive to silence him. And if Avery believed the truth was about to come out," Lestrade leaned forward, "then he might have ended it before disgrace could reach him." Holmes nodded. "Yet there's more. Something is still amiss." I looked between them. Then who pulled the final thread? Who pushed Avery to act now? Holmes moved to his desk and retrieved the envelope that had arrived that morning, unopened. He slit it with his penknife and scanned the contents. Then his expression changed, sharp, alert, as though something had just aligned in his mind. "Watson, do you recall Miss Quenby's mention of a friend in the Foreign Office?" "Yes, her father's colleague. She said he helped her retrieve some of Patterson's old letters." Holmes turned the page toward me. "His name was Julian Severin, and according to this letter, he dined with Colonel Avery 2 nights ago, just before Avery's apparent suicide." Lestrade frowned. "You think this Severin threatened him?" Holmes paced again. "Not directly. But he may have warned him, or hinted that an inquiry was coming. Enough to unnerve a man whose life depended on secrecy. And Miss Quenby, she's the match that lit this fire." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Have her watched, not questioned, watched, discreetly. If anyone else has a stake in silencing this story, she may be in danger." Lestrade nodded, rising. "Understood. I'll send someone reliable." As the door closed behind him, Holmes stood unmoving, staring into the hearth. "I fear," he said softly, "that the duel we thought never happened has finally claimed its victim. But it was not the duel of pistols and honour. It was the duel of secrets and survival. And there is one player still unaccounted for." He turned to me. "Julian Severin. Do you believe he's involved?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "that he knows everything. And that knowledge, Watson, is more dangerous than a loaded pistol." Chapter 11. The Man Behind the Curtain. We left Baker Street the next morning under a weak amber sky. One of those early autumn mornings where the fog lingers low over the rooftops, unwilling to lift. Holmes was unusually quiet as we descended the steps, his coat collar turned up. Against the chill, his eyes lost in thought. "Where are we bound, Holmes?" I asked, falling into step beside him. To Whitehall, Watson, he murmured, where we shall pay a visit to the Honourable Mr. Julian Severin. The hansom cab carried us through streets dappled with fallen leaves and muddied by last night's rain. The closer we drew to the government offices, the more austere the surroundings became. By the time we arrived, the fog had thickened again, curling around the wrought-iron fences and lampposts like watchful sentinels. The building that housed the Foreign Office was a squat, imposing structure. A constable stationed near the entrance glanced at our cards and nodded Holmes through. Without question, within moments we were ushered into a small office panelled in dark oak, dimly lit despite the gas sconces flickering on the walls. Julian Severin rose from behind a desk as we entered. He was a lean man of middle age, dressed immaculately, but with a stiffness that suggested discomfort. His eyes, behind rimless spectacles, were the colour of wet slate, and though his expression was polite, there was a guardedness in it that Holmes noted at once. "Mr. Holmes," Severin said, offering his hand, "and Dr. Watson. I'd heard you were consulting on the Patterson case." Holmes took the seat offered, but did not shake the hand. "Consulting, yes, though it has ceased to be Patterson's case alone." Severin gave a small smile. "No, I imagine not. May I ask what brings you here this morning?" Holmes crossed one leg over the other and examined the man with his usual unblinking intensity. "Colonel Avery is dead." A shadow flickered across Severin's features. "Yes, tragic. I read the report this morning." "You dined with him recently," Holmes said evenly. Severin folded his hands neatly on the desk. "I did. 2 nights ago. It was a professional courtesy. We had worked together long ago. And what did you discuss?" Severin's pause was brief, but telling. Old times, mostly regrets. He seemed agitated. Holmes gave the ghost of a smile. "Regrets have a curious way of surfacing just before exposure. Did you confront him, Mr. Severin?" "Confront?" Severin tilted his head. "About what?" Holmes did not blink. "About Patterson, or more accurately, about William Green, his original name, or about the men who were left behind after a raid that never should have happened." Severin leaned back slightly. "That operation was classified. If you know about it, then you've spoken to people who ought to be dead, or at least invisible. We've spoken to someone who survived, and someone else who did not. But I wonder, Mr. Severin, how it is that Miss Quenby happened to retrieve letters that had been buried for years?" she asked. Severin said, simply, "And I obliged, as a favour to her late father." Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and drew out a small slip of folded parchment. "Forgive me, Watson," he said mildly, "for not showing you this sooner. It arrived anonymously at Baker Street 3 days ago." He handed the note to Severin instead of to me. The man's fingers hesitated before taking it. I leaned in, reading over his shoulder. "The Colonel fears exposure. He will take the cowards. Way out if pressed. The girl must be kept safe. There is still someone watching her." Severin looked up, his face a mask of stony neutrality. "This isn't my handwriting." "No," Holmes agreed, "but it was sent from a government postbox in St. James's Park. And that is where you take your morning walk." Severin slowly set the note on the desk. "I believe this conversation is entering dangerous territory." "For whom?" Holmes asked. For you? For the Foreign Office? Or for a young woman who believes she is avenging her fiancé, but is being used by those who find her grief convenient? I saw Severin's composure fracture for the first time. His jaw tightened, and his fingers trembled slightly against the wood grain. I never meant for her to be harmed, he said at last. Holmes's voice softened. And yet she may be. The last loose end in a very old knot. Severin exhaled, a slow, bitter sigh. Avery orchestrated the entire affair. The failed raid, the falsified reports, the false decorations. Green was one of the only survivors, and he threatened to testify. They bought his silence with an arrangement. Disappear, and you will be protected. And when he returned, I asked. Severin looked at me with hollow eyes. He broke the pact. Worse, he told the girl, and that was enough to ruin them all. Holmes stood, his voice crisp. Mr. Severin, you will say nothing to Miss Quenby. You will not attempt to contact anyone associated with this case. If you do, I will ensure the details of your meeting with Avery become public record. Severin bowed his head slightly. You have my word. As we left, I said nothing for several minutes until we were once more enveloped by fog and the steady clatter of hooves on cobblestone. Do you believe him, Holmes? Holmes tilted his head. He's not a murderer, Watson. But he is a man who deals in shadows, and such men always believe the truth is negotiable. The question is whether the real killer agrees. And who is that in your estimation? Holmes looked out the window. That, he said quietly, is what we shall discover next. Chapter 12. The moment of recognition that evening, Holmes stood by the hearth in our Baker Street sitting room, his silhouette lit in coppery hues from the fire, violin untouched in its case, and pipe left to cool on the table. He was still as a statue, save for the occasional steepling of his fingers beneath his chin. I had known that posture for years. It signified the moment just before revelation. You see it now, don't you? I ventured quietly, breaking the long silence. Holmes did not look at me. It was always there, Watson. I simply refused to believe the evidence of my own reasoning. I waited, but he did not continue. Instead, he turned and opened the small oak box by the bookshelf. He withdrew a folded page, Miss Quenby's letter, and placed it beside 3 other documents. The telegram that had been burned, the anonymous warning note, and a 4th, a railway timetable, ink circled with precise hand. What connected them? He asked, tapping the papers. Think carefully. I rose and approached the desk. Well, the telegram was meant to be destroyed, but it wasn't. Miss Quenby received it after the fact. The anonymous note suggests someone was protecting her, and the train timetable. I stopped. Exactly, Holmes murmured. The train, the key to the timeline. But I thought the telegram was sent after Colonel Avery's death. Holmes gave a small, grim smile. No, Watson. It was meant to appear that way. But look here. This particular train from Dover to London arrives a full 40 minutes later than the one from Brighton. Yet the timestamps suggest the telegram was received before the news of Avery's suicide could have reached Miss Quenby. Sir, mind raced. Then whoever sent that telegram knew Avery was going to die. Holmes nodded once. More precisely, they counted on it. He began pacing, words coming quicker now, as though they had been waiting behind a locked door all day. Avery's death was the linchpin. Miss Quenby's grief, so carefully stoked, was a distraction. Patterson or Green was silenced because he threatened to break a narrative that had been years in the making. I stared at him. But why? Holmes turned to me, and in his gaze I saw the full weight of his conclusion. Because someone wanted to rewrite the past, Watson, to bury the truth of that failed raid, and to ensure that those who benefited from the lies would remain untouchable. But our killer, our true antagonist, had a more personal motive. And who is it? Holmes stepped to the bookshelf, withdrew a slim journal, and flipped it open. Inside were notes I had seen him compile, brief observations seemingly innocuous at the time. The way Miss Quenby flinched when someone mentioned her father, the over-polished boots of the vicar, the ink stain on Julian Severin's glove, despite his immaculate dress, and then one name underlined twice, Eloise Marbury, the housekeeper, I asked in astonishment. She barely spoke. She didn't need to, Holmes replied. She was the one figure present both at the Foreign Office and the country home where Avery died. She was Severin's personal housekeeper, but also inherited the estate of a man dismissed from the army after that same ill-fated raid. Her brother, Captain Marbury, died in disgrace. Avery was one of the officers who escaped court-martial. I was stunned. Then she killed Avery. She didn't need to. She left the rope, the bottle, the unlocked door, and she made certain Miss Quenby discovered him first. She wanted the girl to find him, to suffer. But the letter she intercepted was never meant for Miss Quenby at all, Holmes finished. It was intended for the press, a confession disguised as a love letter. Marbury intercepted it, altered the dates, and redirected the narrative. My head spun. And the anonymous note? Holmes's eyes darkened. That was from Severin. He knew what Marbury intended, but couldn't act without implicating himself. So he warned us, quietly, indirectly. And what now? We go to Surrey, Holmes said. Tonight. Before Miss Marbury has a chance to strike again. I believe she plans to end this saga the same way she began it, with another death disguised as justice. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. I followed suit, heart hammering. As we stepped into the gaslit street, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves like paper whispers. The game had turned, and now it was not only about solving the crime, it was about preventing the final act of vengeance. And Holmes at last had glimpsed the full truth through the dust. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. The train to Surrey arrived under a veil of rain. Holmes and I stepped onto the dim platform at Clayworth Station, where the only illumination came from a single flickering lantern swinging beside the station-master's door. It was close to midnight, and the wind had risen to a shrill whine, slipping through the eaves like a warning whispered by the moor. "Do you think she's still at the Severin estate?" I asked, keeping pace as Holmes led us with long strides down the gravel path. "She has nowhere else to go," he said. "Her task is not yet complete. Marbury's vengeance lies in more than Avery's death. It requires the full dismantling of the Severin name. She intends to destroy Julian next. But why not earlier? Why wait this long?" Holmes cast a quick glance at me. because she needed him broken, not killed in passion or haste, but condemned in the eyes of all who trusted him, a fall from grace as slow and certain as water rotting the roots of a tree. The Severin estate emerged out of the darkness like a shipwreck beached on a hill. The great house was silent, save for a light burning in the upper floor, Julian's study. Holmes did not knock. He led us around to the back, where a servant's entrance stood slightly ajar. "She's here," he murmured. Inside, the house was hushed. A grandfather clock ticked in the hallway, the sound stark and steady. The scent of wax polish mingled with something sourer. Charcoal smoke, I thought. Holmes stopped beside the foot of the staircase and tilted his head. Then we heard it, a muffled cry, a thump overhead, then silence. We bolted up the stairs. Holmes moved like a panther, shoulders taut, eyes sharp. I followed, my revolver drawn, though I cursed myself for how my hand trembled. The study door was locked. Holmes stepped back, then kicked it in with a force that startled even me. Julian Severin was on the floor, dazed, hands bound with a strip of linen. Miss Marbury stood beside the writing desk, a letter opener in one hand, the other pressed to a stack of documents, smoking slightly, already catching flame from a toppled lamp. She looked up at Holmes as if expecting him. "I knew you'd come," she said, her voice curiously calm. Holmes stepped forward. "It ends here, Miss Marbury. The truth is already known." She gave a hollow laugh. "The truth? Which truth would that be? The one where my brother died a disgraced man while Avery rose in rank? The one where Julian here signed away the truth for a pension and a peerage?" Julian groaned. "I didn't sign anything." She lashed out, kicking him hard enough to silence him. Her face twisted. "You kept silent. That was enough." Holmes held up a hand. "Let him go, Eloise." But she did not move. "He'll never pay in a court of law, but perhaps in fire." She flicked a match against the scorched edge of the papers. I raised my pistol. Holmes stepped into the line of fire between her and me. "Eloise," he said gently, "look at your hands. These are not the hands of justice. They are the hands of mourning that never healed." She froze. The flame danced at the edge of the parchment, then faltered. "It wasn't supposed to end this way," she said in a small, lost voice. "I only wanted to restore my brother's name." Holmes moved slowly and took the matchbook from her fingers. "And yet," he said softly, "you nearly took another brother from someone else." The fire was stamped out, the smoke curling toward the ceiling like a spirit freed. Eloise Marbury dropped the letter opener and sat down heavily beside the desk, eyes vacant. By the time Lestrade arrived, summoned with a note Holmes had sent by messenger from the train, Marbury offered no resistance. Julian, still dazed but unhurt, declined to press charges for the assault, but Lestrade, ever the practical officer, took her into custody all the same. As dawn began to pale the sky over Clayworth, Holmes and I stood once more in the foyer of the house. "Do you suppose she'll be charged with murder?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "She will not deny it. Her guilt is not in question. But her mind, I suspect it has walked a very long road of grief." "And Severin?" Holmes glanced up toward the landing. "He will survive, though the truth, once aired, has its own price. The public may never know all of it, but the shadow over his name will not fade quickly. We stepped outside into the fresh morning. The rain had stopped. A pale gold light washed over the hedgerows and fields beyond the estate, banishing the last remnants of night. And yet, even as we walked toward the station, I could not help but feel that the worst of the storm had not been weathered by Julian Severin or Eloise Marbury, but by Holmes himself. For he had looked into the heart of a war-born secret and found, once again, that even the sharpest logic cannot mend what grief has broken. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. The train back to London was quiet, save for the occasional jolt along the rails and the muted whistle echoing through the countryside. Holmes sat opposite me, legs crossed, eyes closed, not in rest, but in some meditative trance known only to him. His fingertips were steepled beneath his chin, and I could see by the furrow in his brow that the case had not quite settled in his mind. For my part, I was still reeling from the events at Clayworth, Miss Marbury's final act, the fire, the bitter truths drawn like poison from the veins of long-buried wounds. There was a heaviness in my chest, the kind that lingers when a moral boundary has been crossed in slow degrees. "Holmes," I said at length, "do you believe she would have killed Severin?" Holmes did not open his eyes. She already had, not with the blade or the fire, but with the truth. The revelation of his silence, the complicity in Avery's corruption, has destroyed his reputation as surely as any physical blow. But she did strike him. She struck what he had become, Holmes murmured, a man who abandoned honour to preserve comfort. It was not the blow that condemned him, but the years of inaction. He opened his eyes then, sharp as ever. "And yet there is still a thread unpulled, Watson. Something has been troubling me since we arrived at Clayworth. A detail far too convenient." I leaned forward. "You think there's more?" "I am certain of it." Holmes tapped the side of his temple. "Let us consider. Miss Marbury planned this quite meticulously. Her return to England, her infiltration into Avery's circles, the timing of his death. But the method remains imprecise. Arsenic is a crude tool for a woman of such intellect." "Are you suggesting someone else poisoned Avery?" Holmes shook his head. "Not quite. I believe the intention was hers, but the execution, Watson, may have been intercepted." I blinked. "Intercepted? The decanter," Holmes said quietly. "The port from which Avery drank. It had been touched not only by Marbury, but by another, someone within the household, close enough to make a substitution unnoticed. You believe she meant to poison him, but someone else acted first?" Holmes nodded, or enhanced the dosage, ensuring her intentions succeeded where her hand might have faltered. Someone with equal motive, but without the patience for courtroom truth. "But who?" "I suspect," Holmes said grimly, "that it is the one person no one thought to question. The same individual who delivered the decanter that night. The one who stood silently in the background, invisible as all good butlers are meant to be." I drew in a sharp breath. "Rigby." Holmes gave a slight nod. "Precisely." We arrived in London that afternoon, and went directly to the flat on Baker Street. Holmes barely paused to remove his coat before throwing himself into the analysis of the final pieces. He summoned Lestrade with a telegram, requesting the coroner's original findings and any overlooked documentation from Avery's estate. By early evening, the documents arrived. I stood by Holmes's side as he unfurled them across the table. "There," he murmured, pointing. "Note the weight of arsenic found in the system, greater than what would result from a single dose in a glass of wine. And yet Miss Marbury swore she only dosed the port lightly, enough to cause illness and suspicion. But why would Rigby increase the dose?" "Because, my dear Watson, he wasn't seeking suspicion. He was seeking silence." Holmes moved to the window, where the gaslight flickered against the grey of the approaching dusk. "Rigby's brother, Watson, killed in the same regiment where Avery served as commander. A court-martial, quickly buried, dismissed from service with a ruined name. A suicide weeks later. It was Rigby who discovered the body." A cold understanding crept over me. "Revenge," I said. Holmes nodded. "The butler saw Miss Marbury's plot as providence. He simply ensured its success." Just then, a knock came at the door. Lestrade entered, hat in hand, expression grave. "We've detained Miss Marbury in Surrey," he said, "but she isn't resisting. She claims full responsibility for Avery's death." Holmes gave him a tight smile. "Then it's time we presented her with the final piece of the puzzle." Lestrade looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the case is not closed, not yet. There is another hand behind the curtain, a silent accomplice whose grief burned colder and deeper than Eloise Marbury's ever could." He turned from the window, his voice cutting clean through the gaslight haze. "Come, Lestrade, we have Aunt a butler to question." Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. It was late the next afternoon when we arrived once more at the imposing threshold of Clayworth House. A grey mist clung to the estate, rising from the damp earth in spectral tendrils, shrouding the hedgerows and softening the corners of the grand stone facade. Holmes, Lestrade, and I approached the entrance with purpose, though the case had taken many turns, most of them steeped in secrets and human frailty. Holmes was unmistakably nearing the heart of it. We were admitted by a maid whose face wore the pallor of one who had seen the last remnants of decorum swept away by scandal. Inside, the drawing-room had been prepared at Holmes's request, and its tall windows, now dim with condensation, looked out onto the overgrown lawn. One by one, the key players were summoned. Eloise Marbury arrived first, her wrists still bearing the faint impressions of handcuffs, though she had been granted temporary liberty at Holmes's insistence. She wore her dark coat as if it were armour, and her gaze was unwavering as she took her seat. Next came Severin Bryce, visibly paler and thinner than the man we had encountered in our earlier visits. Whatever illusions he had maintained had crumbled with Avery's death, and he appeared now only as a man burdened by cowardice and guilt. Beatrice Lonsdale entered silently, her perfume lingering behind her like the scent of wilting roses. Her expression was unreadable, a mask perfected over decades of small betrayals and selective empathy. Then came Miss Harmon, the head housekeeper, rigid, upright, and cautious. She kept glancing toward the hallway, as if fearful someone might arrive who had already departed forever. And finally, Rigby. The butler entered with a grace that belied the tension in the room. Not a flicker of discomfort marred his features. He bowed slightly to Holmes, then took his place by the hearth, standing rather than sitting, as if still bound by the duties of service. Lestrade took up his post near the doorway, arms crossed and notebook in hand, though he had not written a word since we'd stepped foot inside. Holmes remained by the window. He drew back the curtain, allowing the leaden light to fall across the gathered faces. Then, with the silence full as a cathedral, he spoke. "You are all here because something unspoken binds you, not merely the late Mr. Avery, but the manner of his death and the years of deceit that preceded it. There was a stir, no one bold enough to interrupt, yet all visibly bracing for the blow to come." Holmes turned slightly, addressing Miss Marbury first. "You claimed responsibility for the arsenic, and indeed the idea was yours. But you are not a poisoner by practice, Miss Marbury. Your plan was to unsettle, not to kill, to pull back the veil, not to silence a man permanently." Her jaw tightened. "And yet he died." "Because someone ensured he would," Holmes replied gently. "Your actions laid the framework, but another hand sealed it." He turned now toward Rigby, whose expression had not altered in the slightest. "Tell me, Mr. Rigby, do you remember the day your younger brother was sent home from the front lines, dishonoured and discarded for a theft he didn't commit?" There was the faintest tremor in the butler's fingers. Holmes, ever watchful, noted it. "My brother was 20, Rigby said at last, voice measured. "He didn't understand what he was accused of. The charge was concocted by his superior officer, Avery. My brother came home and never recovered. 3 weeks later, I found him in our garden shed. He'd hanged himself." Gasps rippled through the room. Miss Lonsdale pressed her gloved hand to her mouth. Severin Bryce lowered his eyes. "I kept quiet for years," Rigby continued. "I needed employment, and Clayworth gave me that. But when Miss Marbury returned, and I saw what she intended, I thought, perhaps this was Providence. I could let her plan unfold, and if she failed, well, I would not." "You replaced the decanter," Holmes said softly. "Yes. You added to the dosage." A pause, then a nod. "And you've lived with this all your life." Another nod, though slower now, the weight of the truth visibly settling on his shoulders. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You may arrest him, Inspector." Lestrade hesitated. "But Miss Marbury confessed. What charges?" "Murder by deliberate poisoning," Holmes replied firmly. "While Miss Marbury conspired to expose Avery, Rigby ensured that exposure could never lead to legal reckoning. He ensured it ended with death." Rigby looked not relieved nor afraid, but curiously at peace. "I did not wish him to suffer," he said. "Only to end." Miss Marbury stared at him in silence. Then she nodded once, a grim gesture of shared pain. Lestrade placed a hand on Rigby's arm, and the old butler rose with quiet dignity. As he was led from the room, he paused at the door and looked back, not at Holmes, but at Miss Marbury. "I'm sorry," he said. The door closed behind him. Holmes turned away from the window. Justice, it seems, has a peculiar sense of timing, not always legal nor tidy, but occasionally inevitable. He bowed slightly to the room. The game, as they say, is done. Chapter 16. The reveal. Holmes breaks down. The crime. The drawing-room at Clayworth House was quieter than it had been all day. The fire sputtered softly in the hearth, but no one moved to tend it. Every eye in the room was fixed on Sherlock Holmes as he paced slowly before the windows, his hands clasped behind his back and his gaze thoughtful. Inspector Lestrade had departed with Rigby in custody, leaving behind a trail of stunned silence and shifting glances. Beatrice Lonsdale sat rigidly on the edge of a damask armchair, her lips pressed so tightly together they were almost colourless. Severin Bryce rubbed his hands together absently, as though trying to wipe away invisible guilt. Eloise Marbury sat slightly apart from the others, her eyes trained on Holmes with a strange combination of trepidation and relief. Holmes turned finally and faced the room. I remained by the mantelpiece, notebook in hand, though I knew I would be unable to capture the full brilliance of what was to follow. "It is time," Holmes said, "to unravel the threads that have entangled this house for nearly a decade." His voice, though soft, carried the weight of truth. He gestured toward a small table, where the decanter of wine, sealed now in evidence, bags, and the remains of Avery's letter lay. When Lord Edward Avery died, many were quick to see his past catching up to him. But it was not merely past misdeeds. It was the deliberate orchestration of his downfall by two parties who believed themselves unconnected. Miss Marbury wished for a reckoning, an exposure of the hypocrisy she had fled years earlier. She returned under the guise of reconciliation, yet she had already laid plans to make her uncle ill. Gravely so, but not fatally. She assumed wrongly that her actions alone had done the deed. Miss Marbury lowered her eyes. Holmes continued, now addressing the room more broadly. But her plans would not have succeeded without the intervention of a second hand, one hiding in plain sight. Rigby, the butler, a man whom no one questioned, who poured Avery's wine, polished his boots, and stood silently by as guests and tempers came and went, a man whose own brother had been ruined by Avery's petty tyranny during the war. Rigby waited, patient and precise, for an opportunity. Miss Marbury presented it. "Are you suggesting," Beatrice Lonsdale interrupted coldly, "that our butler waited nearly a decade to exact revenge?" "Not waited," Holmes replied. "Watched, calculated. You see, Lady Lonsdale, revenge of this sort is not swift. It is not fire, it is frost. Slow, creeping, and inevitable once it takes root." Beatrice's mouth twitched, but she said nothing further. Holmes strode to the writing desk, where he retrieved a small vial. "This," he said, holding it up between thumb and forefinger, "was found behind a loose board in Rigby's quarters. Traces of arsenic. Not enough for repeated doses, but enough to supplement what Miss Marbury had already introduced." Severin. Bryce gave a visible shiver. "But why now? Why not years ago?" "Because Avery was already losing control," Holmes said. "His debts, his crumbling relationships, the whispers about past misdeeds, all made him vulnerable. Rigby did not want to draw suspicion. He needed another party to carry the blame. Miss Marbury was ideal, and so the stage was set." He turned to face me then. "Watson, do you recall the second set of footprints in the cellar dust? The ones leading away from the wine cellar?" "Of course," I said. "We believed them to belong to Miss Marbury." They did not. Miss Marbury had no reason to return to the cellar after her tampering. But Rigby did. The second set of footprints belonged to him, made after he ensured the decanter would go to Avery's table. Not just tainted, but fatal. "And the telegram?" I asked. "The one Miss Marbury burned?" "A clever misdirection," Holmes said. "Its contents were genuine, a warning from a friend in Cairo. But its destruction convinced us she had something urgent to hide. In reality, it distracted us from the more subtle manipulations of Rigby, who never needed to speak at all." 2. Room fell silent again. Holmes looked at each of them in turn. "You see now, I trust, how an impossible death was not impossible at all. But the truth, buried in dust, wine and silence, was simply waiting for the right eyes. No one responded." The tension that had filled the room seemed to drain, slowly, as the full weight of Holmes's reasoning settled upon each listener. Even Severin Bryce, for all his pretense and his drama, looked like a man truly humbled for, the first time in his life, Miss Marbury stood at last. "I never intended," she began. Holmes raised a hand. "No need to finish. Intention and consequence are rarely close companions. What matters now is that the truth is known, and justice, in its quiet way, has been done." With that, he stepped toward the door. I followed. Behind us, Clayworth House remained as we had found it, majestic, silent, and full of secrets too long held in its walls. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The morning after the revelation was one of cold clarity, as though the weather itself conspired to echo the mood left hanging in Clayworth House. A light frost had settled across the lawns and hedgerows, and a thin mist curled over the fields, muting the colours of the countryside and wrapping the village of Brabourne in a stillness that was almost reverent. I stood at the window of the inn, watching a cart creak past on the road below. Its driver tipped his hat solemnly to a constable posted near the estate's entrance, one of several, stationed there by Lestrade, who had returned at dawn to supervise the final arrangements. Holmes sat at the small table behind me, the remnants of our breakfast untouched, his gaze fixed not on the food, but on the morning paper. He was calm, thoughtful, but I could tell he was not yet finished. "Do you believe," I asked, "that Miss Marbury will be charged?" Holmes looked up. "That is a matter for Scotland Yard and eventually the courts. But I suspect not. Her confession was incomplete, and her contribution, while morally reprehensible, did not directly result in Lord Avery's death. She gave the first push," I said, "and Rigby finished the work." Holmes folded the paper and placed it aside. "Precisely. But it is the finishing that makes it murder, Watson. In the eyes of the law, intention alone, without consequence, is not always enough. Rigby's actions were deliberate, calculated, and fatal. His fate is sealed. Indeed, Rigby had been taken into custody hours earlier, after Holmes had presented the vial, the footprint analysis, and the timeline of his movements. His silence had not wavered, not even when faced with the mountain of deductions that had exposed his role, but his expression, as they led him out past the marble stair and down the path to the waiting carriage, was neither contrite nor fearful. "He looked at you?" I said, recalling the moment vividly. "Right before they closed the carriage door." Holmes nodded. "Yes, and what did you read in his eyes?" I hesitated. "Something like pity, or perhaps contempt." Holmes gave a rare, faint smile. There is no greater contempt than that of a man who thinks his vengeance noble. Rigby believed himself an instrument of justice, and when such a man is proven wrong, he does not break, he hardens. I shivered, though the fire crackled gently at our side. And the others? Lady Beatrice will cling to her pride, Holmes said, and retreat behind the veil of decorum. Severin Bryce will write his memoirs with considerably more humility, or so I hope. And Miss Marbury, well, she will carry this weight far longer than the courts ever could. He rose, collecting his coat from the hook. I suspect, he continued, that Clayworth House will remain closed for some time. The family's reputation lies in tatters, but reputations are a currency easily restored in polite society. What cannot be restored is the innocence of those who thought their secrets buried. We walked together down to the lane, the sound of our boots muffled by the frost-bitten earth. Holmes paused once to glance back at the estate. There was a time, he murmured, when the great country homes of England stood as monuments to stability and honour. Now they are mausoleums of hypocrisy, their walls stuffed with whispers and grudges. That is why they crumble, not from age, but from rot. It was a rare philosophical turn, and I let it settle in silence as we approached the waiting carriage that would return us to London. Lestrade met us at the corner, his notebook bulging from his coat pocket. "We'll sort through the paperwork," he muttered. "Plenty of it, but the higher-ups are satisfied. Good work, Holmes, though next time, if you could give me a little more warning before you spring a trap." "I shall endeavour to do so," Holmes replied mildly, stepping into the carriage. As we set off down the winding lane, I took one last glance over my shoulder. Clayworth House stood as it had before, tall, grey, unyielding, but now I could not help but see it as Holmes had described. A monument, yes, but to something hollow and haunted. I looked to Holmes. "Will you rest now?" He arched a brow. "Rest? My dear Watson, there is a manuscript on the Van Tassel, cipher awaiting transcription, a matter of great interest at the Royal Society regarding a vanished physicist, and a note from Mycroft concerning unusual diplomatic movements in Vienna. Rest will have to wait." And so, with the case of Clayworth House behind us, and the long road of deduction stretching before, we rode on into the London fog, Holmes alert, I at his side, and the mystery already consigned to history. Chapter 18. Holmes's Final Reflection. The train to London clattered steadily beneath us, its rhythmic cadence a quiet accompaniment to the lingering echoes of Clayworth House. Outside the window, the countryside blurred into smudges of winter grey and brittle gold. I sat across from Holmes, notebook closed in my lap, yet my mind still turning over the sequence of revelations that had unspooled over the past days. Holmes had not spoken for some time. He sat motionless, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half-lidded in the way they were when his mind was most active. He appeared, as always, after a case, to retreat into that curious realm of private contemplation where few could follow. At last he stirred. "You remain pensive, Watson," he said, his voice low. "Is there still some aspect of the case that troubles you?" I looked at him. "Only this. If Miss Marbury had not confessed in part, would we have ever suspected Rigby fully? He played his part so cleanly. The butler, invisible, unassuming. And precisely because of that, Holmes interrupted softly. He drew my attention. He opened his eyes fully now, and I saw that faint gleam, something between satisfaction and melancholy. "You see, Watson," he continued, "there is a natural flaw in the human pattern of suspicion. We distrust those who appear eager, impassioned, even overconfident. But we are far too comfortable with the quiet, the servile, the ones who fade into the wallpaper. Rigby used that to his advantage. A lifetime of discretion provided him the perfect camouflage. He turned to the window, watching the trees flicker past. He believed himself a moral man. That, perhaps, is what chilled me most. His murder was not a moment of madness, but an act calculated in cold philosophy. He judged Lord Avery and acted as jury and executioner." I shook my head. "And Miss Marbury?" Holmes's expression softened. "Guilt is a peculiar thing, Watson. Hers was not born from the act itself, but from the knowledge that her inaction, her silence, had fed a greater crime. Her whisper lit the fuse. Rigby merely struck the match." I was silent for a moment, then leaned forward. "There's something else. You knew Rigby would attempt to remove the evidence. That final confrontation by the library fireplace, the page he tore from the servant's journal. You let him do it." Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes, it confirmed what I suspected. I had already read the journal. Lady Beatrice had left it unattended when she thought I was more interested in her porcelain collection. Rigby's desperation to destroy that single page confirmed he had read it too, and that he feared what it contained. And yet you allowed him the illusion of control." "Precisely. An illusion, I might add, he maintained until the end. But illusions are easily broken with a breath of truth." He tapped a finger against the armrest. "The curious thing, Watson, is that most people are not murdered over diamonds, or inheritances or affairs. Not really. They are murdered over pride, over secrets buried so long they become part of the foundation, until one misplaced stone causes the entire facade to crumble." I nodded slowly. "And Clayworth House?" Holmes turned back to me, his gaze distant yet sharp. "It will stand, of course. Such places always do. But those who remain will never walk its halls without hearing the echo of that misstep. The crack in the marble, the shadow behind the curtain." He picked up his gloves and stood as the train began to slow, the outer districts of London creeping into view. "Come, Watson, we've returned to our city of soot and secrets. There is always another case, another deception waiting in the fog. But let this one remind us, even in the grandest homes, beneath polished staircases and ancestral pride, human frailty hides in the dust." I followed him down the corridor, my coat tucked under one arm, already reaching for my notebook again, because Holmes was right. The case was over, but the story, his story, was only ever just beginning.